First and Second books of Kings are the story of Israel's decline, whereas First and Second Samuel document Israel's shift from corrupt judges to the righteous leadership of David. Kings shows where Israel divides and falls into the hands of her enemies. These books of history pick up where 2 Samuel left off. Israel is united under the godly King David, who appoints his son Solomon to rule after him. Solomon is blessed with wisdom and charged with building a majestic temple to the Lord in Jerusalem. God tells Solomon to remember him and follow his father David's example. Unfortunately, Solomon is unfaithful to God in later years, and God divides the kingdom after his death. The northern 10 tribes follow Solomon's former warrior and taskmaster, Jeroboam, and the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remain loyal to the throne of David. The rest of these books document the way these kings, and those who followed, lead God's people to worship. Each king is remembered according to whether or not they lead Israel to worship God in Jerusalem or worship idols elsewhere. Neither the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah keep the law of Moses and worship God at Jerusalem. Therefore, both are taken captive by enemy nations. Israel is taken by Assyria, and Judah falls to Babylon, which is just what God promised would happen if they disobeyed his law. The basic summary of these 2 books is found in 1 Kings chapter 9. As for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons indeed turn away from following me, do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. The books begin with David, old and bedridden, and his son, Adonijah, proclaims himself king with the help of David's commander Joab and the priest Abiathar. Hearing this news, David instructs the prophet Nathan to anoint David's son Solomon as king. The people rally behind Solomon in a grand procession to the royal throne. Before dying, David charges Solomon to remain faithful to God and his laws. Solomon solidifies his claim to the throne by killing Joab, Adonijah, and the remaining dissenters from David's reign. He also makes an alliance with Egypt by marrying the Pharaoh's daughter. Because Solomon carefully obeys God's laws, God appears to him in a dream and offers to grant the new king one wish. Solomon asks for wisdom to govern with justice and to know the difference between right and wrong. God is so impressed with Solomon's humble request that he promises Solomon the additional gifts of wealth and long life. As a result, Solomon lives in tremendous opulence, and his empire stretches from Egypt to the Euphrates River. He earns international fame for his wise sayings and scientific knowledge. With his vast resources, Solomon builds an elaborate temple to God, as well as a palace for himself in Jerusalem. Construction begins exactly 480 years after Israel's exodus from Egypt. Solomon conscripts thousands of labourers for the work. He imports materials from neighbouring countries. The temple is lined with gold and features large hand-sculpted angels and pillars. Solomon places the Ark of the Covenant inside, and all of Israel gather for the dedication. After sacrificing herds of animals on the altar, Solomon prays for God's blessing on the temple. God appears to Solomon and promises to dwell in the temple as long as Solomon and the Israelites are obedient to his laws. If they are not, God will remove his presence from the temple, destroying both the temple and the nation. Solomon's success continues until he marries many foreign women. They influence him to worship and erect altars to foreign deities. God tells Solomon he will tear away all the tribes from Solomon's kingdom except one, Judah. God allows the tribe of Judah to remain, since Solomon is David's son. Following God's declaration, a prophet meets one of Solomon's officials, Jeroboam, with a cloak torn into 12 pieces, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. The prophet hands Jeroboam 10 of the 12 pieces and explains that God has chosen him to rule these selected tribes as Israel's new king. Solomon dies, and Rehoboam assumes the throne of Israel. Led by Jeroboam, the people gather before the young king to request that Rehoboam treat them more kindly than Solomon did. Rehoboam is headstrong and refuses, threatening to punish and enslave the people. The Israelites unite in rebellion, cursing the tribe of Judah and eluding Rehoboam's attempts to forcefully subdue them. They head north, where they crown Jeroboam king of Israel in the city of Shechem. Israel splits into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Solomon's first major task is to build the temple of the Lord. To achieve this architectural feat, Solomon employs professionals from all corners of his kingdom. He also had 70,000 labourers, 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country, and Solomon's 3,300 supervisors who were over the work, having charge of the people who did the work. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. They were 8 meters tall, and a cord of 5 meters would encircle each. He made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on top of the pillars. Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north, in front of the inner sanctuary. The flowers, the lamps, the tongs, each of gold, the cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, fire pans, also all of gold, the sockets for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the nave of the temple, all gold. Thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. Solomon brought in the things that his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, the vessels. He stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. From accomplished professionals to forced labourers, the people of the kingdom contributed their knowledge and skills to help build the temple. In so doing, Solomon involves numerous people to help build and sustain his kingdom. Whether or not it is Solomon's intention, employing so many people from all walks of life ensures the vast majority of citizens hold personal investment in the political, religious, social, and economic well-being of the kingdom. The temple had taken 7 years to build. It was 4.5 stories high, with many parts of it covered in gold. But Solomon didn't boast about these things. Instead, he noted that what had been made was special in God's presence. He prayed, "The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built. May your eyes be open towards this temple night and day, this place of which you said, 'My name shall be there.'" God doesn't just speak to us here, he also listens to us. Solomon was confident of this, and so he prayed about the non-Jews who would come to worship at the temple in Jerusalem. When he comes and prays towards this temple, then hear from heaven, your dwelling place, and do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of this earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people in Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. The massive national effort needed to construct the temple leaves Solomon the ruler of a powerful kingdom. During his reign, Israel's military and economic might reached their peak, and the kingdom covers more territory than at any time in Israel's history. He completes the centralization of the nation's government, economic organization, and worship. To assemble a large enough labor force, King Solomon conscripts workers out of all Israel, 30,000 men in total. Solomon seems to have paid Israelites who were conscripted in accordance with Leviticus, which forbids making slaves of Israelites. In addition, a multitude of workers were brought in from surrounding nations. Whatever their source, a wide variety of highly skilled professionals came together, including the best artisans practicing at the time. The king organizes the nation into 12 sectors and appoints a deputy as overseer over each sector. Israel becomes like other kingdoms, with forced labor, heavy taxation, and a central elite wielding power over the rest of the country. As Samuel had foretold, kings bring a greatly expanded military. Militarization comes into full flower during Solomon's reign, as the military becomes an essential component of the kingdom's stability. However, unlike his father David, Solomon is called a man of peace, but the peace is ensured by the presence of a well-organized and well-provisioned military force. Samuel's prophecy about the dangers of a king is fulfilled in Solomon's time. On the surface, Solomon's administration and building campaigns appear to have been very successful. The people are happy to make the required sacrifices in order to build the temple, a place where all can go to receive God's justice and forgiveness, healing and mercy. But after the temple is completed, Solomon builds a palace of the same scale and magnificence as the temple. As he becomes accustomed to power and wealth, he becomes self-serving, arrogant and unfaithful. He appropriates a large portion of the nation's productive capacity for his personal benefit. His already impressive throne of ivory is overlaid with gold. He entertains lavishly. He reneges on agreements with allies, and he keeps a consort of 700 wives and 300 concubines. This last is his ultimate undoing, for he loved many foreign women, with the result that, when he was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not true to the Lord his God. He built shrines to Astarte, Milcom, Chemosh, and Molech. Given the covenant requirement that the faithfulness of the king to the Lord would be the key to the prosperity of the nation, Israel would soon descend rapidly from its peak. God, it seems, cares deeply whether we work for his purposes or against them. Amazing fates are only possible when we work according to God's plans. Solomon knew in his head that God had miraculously been with his father, David, and he had seen the blessings of God as Israel had risen to be the greatest nation in the world. But Solomon had become so deceived by his compromise that he somehow thought he would worship other gods and continue in the blessing of Almighty God. David had been a man who would inquire of God before major decisions. he would humble himself before God when he was wrong. Consequently, God said that David was the man after his own heart. Solomon, on the other hand, set out to rationalize his way through life. God warned Solomon what would happen if he or his sons turned from following him. The kingdom was torn apart, and Israel has never been the same, even to this day. We then meet the Queen of Sheba. She has everything. Historically, she was most likely the ruler of present-day Ethiopia or Yemen. Ethiopian tradition gives her the name Makeda, which means not this way. She undoubtedly has everything life can offer. She comes with a caravan of servants and gifts for Solomon. In fact, she brings 4.5 tons of gold and presents it as a gift to Solomon. She has it all, but she's looking for something more. She's skeptical and came to prove Solomon with hard questions. Solomon answers all her questions. In fact, what she had heard about the king and his kingdom wasn't half as good as what she experienced. Not only was she impressed with the king, but with his people. After resisting, proving, and questioning, she finally gives in. She gives all that she has to the king: gold, spices, precious stones, musical instruments, trees. In turn, the king gave unto the Queen of Sheba all her desire, whatever she asked, beside that which Solomon gave her of his royal bounty. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. Solomon is only the 3rd king in Israel, but already the kingdom has reached its high point. Over the next 400 years, one bad king after another leads the nation into decline, disintegration, and defeat. After Solomon's death, it soon becomes clear that unrest has been brewing beneath the veneer of equitable and effective management. Following the great king's death, Jeroboam, earlier the head of the forced labourers, and all the assembly of Israel approached the king's son and successor Rehoboam and asked him to lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke. They're ready to pledge loyalty to the new king in return for a reduction in forced labour and high taxes. But for 40 years, Rehoboam has only known luxurious palace living, staffed and provisioned by the Israelite people. His sense of entitlement is too strong to allow for compromise. Rather than easing the undue burden placed on the people by his father, Rehoboam chooses to make their yoke even greater. A rebellion ensues and the monarchy becomes divided forever. As much as the people of Israel had been willing to perform their fair share of labour to support the state, the emergence of unrealistic and unreasonable expectations results in revolt and division. The 10 northern tribes secede, anointing Jeroboam as their king. Although he's been a leader in the delegation seeking tax relief from Rehoboam, his dynasty proves no better for its people. For 2 centuries, the northern kingdom of Israel is ruled by kings who do great evil in the sight of the Lord. These centuries are marked by constant war, treason, and murder, culminating in a catastrophic defeat by the nation of Assyria. To destroy all sense of national identity, Assyrian conquerors carry off the population, dispersing them in different parts of their empire and bringing in foreigners to populate the conquered land. The failings of leaders often have a devastating effect on their people. God's ways often seem strange to us. We do not always understand what he's doing. He doesn't do things the way that we think they should be done. Which brings us to our next key player in the book, the prophet Elijah. He prophesied to the king exactly what the weather would be, and that he knew when it would change. The lack of rain caused a famine, but God provided food for his prophet, brought to him by ravens. Now, one would expect the ravens, birds of prey, to eat any food they had. But Elijah's trust was not to be in the birds, but in the sure word of him that promised. God could have sent angels to minister to him. Ravens neglect their own young and do not feed them. Yet, when God pleased, they shall feed his prophet. So food was fine, but soon there was no water. After a while the brook dries up, and God gave him a strange command. Go to Zarephath, and there you will find a widow woman who will sustain you. Now, Zarephath was the very place that Jezebel had come from, that evil queen. God did not send him to some wealthy person with great resources, but to a poor widow with very little means. Reasoning would have told Elijah that a widow was the last person in the world who could sustain him. And when he got there, reasoning would appear even more justified. Not only was she a widow, but she was in poverty and down to her last meal. God's commands do not always appeal to our intellect, though in fact they are the most logical, because it is what God has told us to do. We're not asked to understand God's commands, we're only asked to obey them. We need no other reason to do them than that they are his commands. Faith is trusting that God knows best, even when his strategy may appear unlikely. With the miracle of the oil continuing daily, Elijah and the widow and her son are getting along wonderfully, despite the famine that has raged all around them. Then one day their peace is abruptly interrupted. The widow woman's son dies. Elijah and the widow were walking obedient lives, yet in spite of their noble obedience, they now experience a tremendous trial in the sudden death of the widow's son. Though the trial may seem strange to us, it's not strange to God. He knows what he's doing. God has a reason for every trial, and they're always good reasons. The trial proved beyond any shadow of doubt that Elijah was a man of God, as God uses him to raise the child back to life again. Trials are not a waste, they're not a loss, they're not a mistake. They produce some of the greatest blessings that man can possess. Elijah was never a man to back away from a challenge. Taking the people firmly to choose a side, he took a stand. It's not that they're against God, but they're not really sold out to God either. They're just drifting along. So Elijah says, how long will you waver between two opinions? You see, God doesn't want us to be lukewarm in our walk with him. He wants all of us. So Elijah proposes a clinical trial. Both Yahweh and Baal are supposed to be able to control thunder, lightning and storms. So Elijah says, why don't we do a little experiment to see which one comes through first? Each side choose a bull for sacrifice and lay it on the altar. And the first god to burn up the sacrifice wins. Graciously, Elijah allows the prophets of Baal to go first. They lay their animal on the altar and begin to pray. From morning until noon, they cry out to Baal to come through, but hear nothing. They get louder and wilder. They begin to dance and stomp and shout. Elijah begins to get sarcastic with them. Hey, maybe you should shout louder. Maybe your God's fallen asleep. And so they do. They get louder. They scream. They dance. They cut themselves, trying to get Baal's attention for 3 more hours, but still no answer. Elijah is utterly dependent on God to come through. He calls for silence from the crowd and invites people to gather in closer. He then uses 12 stones for a visual illustration. It's a reminder of when the 12 tribes crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land, and the people then to make a pile of 12 stones to mark the event for future generations. God uses Elijah's object lesson to remind the people, I am your God. I always have been, and I still am. Elijah prepares his sacrifice and then, bizarrely, drenches the entire sacrifice with water. So much water that it even fills the troughs around the altar. And then Elijah began to pray. He's standing up against an evil king and 450 of his false prophets. All the prophets of the one true God are either in hiding in a cave or long dead. Elijah is alone. In Elijah's great showdown, God responds immediately. Lightning strikes the altar and completely consumes the sacrifice, even the water in the troughs around it. The people fall on their faces and repent, turning back to the one true God. Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. And God brings refreshing, life-giving rain again, all through Elijah's faith. At around the same time, a man named Obadiah is instrumental in saving 100 prophets. Obadiah is the chief of staff in King Ahab's palace. Ahab is renowned even today as the most wicked of Israel's kings. Ahab's evil queen, Jezebel, orders the prophets of the Lord to be killed. As a high official in Ahab's court, Obadiah has advanced word of the operation, as well as the means to circumvent it. He hides 100 prophets in 2 caves and provides them bread and water until the crises abate. They are saved because someone who has immense faith in the Lord is in a position of authority to protect them. King Ahab of Israel then faced a battle with King Ben-Hadad of Syria. Ben-Hadad has threatened to take over Israel. He simply sent word that he was coming and assumed that Ahab would just give up. He had a great army involving 32 kings and their men, and he had an even greater ego. But he had a bad plan. Ben-Hadad sent word to Ahab that he would take his gold, silver, wives and children. Then he added servants. At first, Ahab appears to give in, but the people of Israel told him not to give in. Round 1 goes to God's people, Israel. They may have had an evil king, but they're still God's chosen nation. Ben-Hadad comes up with a new plan. His advisors give him new advice. The Israelites only won on the mountains because to God is only good in the mountains. If they fight in the valley, their God is weak and cannot win. But the valley is where we most rely on God. The valley is where we find our faith to be real. The valley is where we're tested the most. God is the same whether it's in a mountain or valley. He's still in control. The battle plans are switched. The overconfident enemy has underestimated God. All Israel have to do is trust God to deliver them in the valley, just as he delivered them on the mountain. God promises a great victory. 6 days passed. The anticipation, anxiety and agony of knowing that battle was upon them was real. They did not retreat, though they were severely outnumbered. They did not run, though they were surrounded and already in a valley. On the 7th day the battle began. The Israelites slaughtered 100,000 foot soldiers of Syria in one day. Some Syrians fled from the battle, including King Ben-Hadad. God dropped the city wall on 27,000 of them as they ran. Only King Ben-Hadad survived. God delivered him into Ahab's hands to complete the victory. God is God on the mountain and in the valley. As we move into the second book of Kings, Elijah issues a strong warning against ignoring God. This gives the enemy a foothold, frequently causes us to pursue idolatry, and often brings personal injury. Finally, ignoring God can lead to premature death. By now, Ahaziah is on the throne, the son of Ahab. He decides he's going to send troops to arrest the man of God. His mother, Jezebel, intimidated Elijah. Maybe he can do the same thing. God is always ready to give mercy when we humble ourselves and ask for it. I believe Ahaziah could have received mercy just like his father Ahab did, if he had only humbled himself. Elijah was an ordinary man who did some extraordinary things. Elijah the Tishbite who stood against King Ahab when he took Naboth's vineyard. He proved on Mount Carmel that Baal was not a god. Now he was moving on, his mission is over. The Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah therefore desires to teach the prophet Elisha a few things about some locations. He told Elisha of Gilgal, where God was saying to the Israelites that he had rolled away the reproach of Egypt. Forget your past. He told Elisha of Bethel, the house of God, where Jacob said, surely the Lord is in this place. I was not aware of it. Times will be tough, but there is always refuge in the house of God. He told Elisha of Jericho and its clear lesson to do what God says. He told Elisha of Jordan, the place of death and life, where the generation that left Egypt die on this side of the Jordan, while the others pass into life. Elijah took his cloak, he rolled it up and struck the Jordan, and they crossed onto dry land. Then Elijah said to Elisha, tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken? Elisha said, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. The chariots and horsemen came to collect Elijah, and Elisha saw him no more. As the northern kings slide deeper into apostasy and tyranny, God raises up prophets to oppose them more forcefully than ever. Elisha is called to stand against Israel's rebellious kings throughout a long career. His actions show that he tries to protect the people from the disasters brought on by the kings. Elisha's first major act is to cleanse the polluted well in the city of Jericho. The chief concern in the passage is agricultural productivity. Without a wholesome well, the land is unfruitful. By restoring access to clean water, Elisha makes it possible for the people of the city to resume the God-given mission of humanity to be fruitful, multiply, and produce food. One of the prophets of Elisha's circle died, and his family fell into debt. The fate of a destitute family member in ancient Israel was typically to sell some or all of its members into slavery, where at least they would be fed. The widow is on the verge of selling her 2 children as slaves and begs Elisha for help. Elisha comes up with a plan for the family to become economically productive and support themselves. He asks the widow what she has to work with. Nothing, she says, except a jar of oil. Apparently, this is enough capital for Elisha to begin with. He tells her to borrow empty jars from all her neighbours and fill them with oil from her jar. She's able to fill every jar with oil before her own jar runs out. And the profit from selling the oil is enough to pay the family's debts. In essence, Elisha creates an entrepreneurial community within which the woman is able to start a small business. Elisha's actions on behalf of this family reflect God's love and concern for those in need. Next, we meet Naaman, the successful and wise captain of the armies of the king of Syria. Everything looked great on the outside, but there was a problem on the inside. He was a leper. The king of Syria sent him to the king of Israel, but he could do nothing. Elisha heard of the situation and offered to help. Naaman wanted to be heard, to be honoured, but he needed to be healed. Elisha paid no attention to his position, his power, his prestige, his possessions. He had a message from God, a simple message: go and wash. A saving message: and your flesh shall come clean again. Naaman was very unimpressed. He wanted to be healed, but he wanted to be healed on his terms. Naaman thought that God ought to do things his way, that his way was better than God's way. When it comes to salvation, God only has one way, his way. However, Naaman was persuaded by his servants to do as instructed, and immediately he was cleansed of his sickness. He also immediately made a very public and strong statement of profession. Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore, I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. Naaman offers to reward Elisha handsomely for the healing, but Elisha will accept nothing for what he regards as simply doing the Lord's will. However, one of Elisha's entourage, a man called Gehazi, sees an opportunity for an extra remuneration. Gehazi chases after Naaman and says that Elisha has changed his mind. He will accept a very significant payment after all. After receiving the payment, Gehazi hides his ill-gotten gains and then lies to Elisha to cover it up. Elisha responds by announcing that Gehazi will be struck with the very leprosy that had left Naaman, and that is indeed what happened. Cutting wood along the bank of the Jordan River, one of Elisha's fellow prophets loses an iron axe head in the river. He borrowed the axe from a lumberjack. The price of such a substantial piece of iron in the Bronze Age would have meant financial ruin for the owner, and the prophet who borrowed it is distraught. Elisha takes the economic loss as a matter of personal concern and causes the iron to float on top of the water, where it can be retrieved and returned to its owner. Once again, Elisha intervenes. The gift of the prophet is to discern God's aims in daily life and to work and act accordingly. Next, we see a severe famine in Samaria. The famine was so severe that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and even some dove droppings for 5 shekels of silver. A shekel is worth about 15 grams of silver, so to buy a donkey's head, you would need 750 grams of silver. Even cannibalism wasn't off the table, with one woman apparently eating her son. This was a hopeless situation the entire nation was going through. Day by day, death was only coming closer to them. Desperate needs were everywhere, distressing and horrendous. At this juncture, the king of Samaria seeks to kill the prophet Elisha. The king believed that God was responsible for this situation in the nation, so in his anger, he wanted to kill Elisha. Elisha foretells a miracle that would end the famine, but one of the senior officers said it was impossible and could never happen. The words of the officer echo the hopelessness he was going through. Utter hopelessness. No way my situation can change. In a hopeless situation, it's hard to have hope, hard to have faith in God, hard to believe that a miracle is possible. But you need faith to experience a miracle. And, as told by the prophet Elisha, the miracle took place in an amazing way. Chapter 13 gives the final reference to Elisha's ministry of 50 or 60 years, after 10 or 15 years of an apprenticeship to Elijah. He would be about 80 years old at the time of this passage. It's been calculated that 42 miracles are recorded by these two prophets, 14 to Elijah and 28 to Elisha. And this in a nation that wandered away from God. The king is now Jehoash, the grandson of Jehu, who instigated the uprising against Ahab's house. He was evil in God's sight. He recognized the impact of God upon the nation. The king also recognized Elisha as the defense of Israel, physical as well as spiritual and moral. Although Elisha was on his sickbed, he still had words that God wanted him to speak. It's noticeable that there was no one to pass the baton from Elisha. Following in the footsteps of the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom's rulers soon began to decline into idolatry and evil. Under Rehoboam's rule, the people built for themselves high places, pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were male temple prostitutes in the land. They committed all the abominations of the nations. Rehoboam's successors oscillated between faithfulness and doing evil in God's sight. For a while, Judah had enough good kings to stave off disaster. But in the final years, the kingdom fell to the same state that the northern kingdom had. The nation was conquered, and the kings and leaders were captured and deported by the Babylonians. The faithlessness of the kings whom the people had demanded, against God's advice hundreds of years earlier, culminated in financial meltdown, destruction of the labour force, famine, and the mass murder or deportation of much of the population. The predicted disaster lasts 70 years until King Cyrus of Persia authorises the return of some of the Jews to rebuild Jerusalem's temple and walls. King Hezekiah of Judah presents an example of the arrogance of the kings. Hezekiah is sick to the point of death. He begs God to recover, and God, by the word of the prophet Isaiah, grants him 15 more years of life. Meanwhile, the neighbouring king of Babylon hears word of Hezekiah's illness and sends envoys to spy out whether the situation makes Israel free for conquest. By the time they arrive, Hezekiah is fully recovered. Perhaps the miraculous recovery made him feel invincible, because instead of proving his health and rapidly sending spies on their way, he decides to show off the riches of his treasury to them. This makes Israel even more tempting target than ever. God responds to this foolish action by sending Isaiah to prophesy further. God's servant prophesied that after Hezekiah is gone, his sons will be captured and mutilated and the kingdom destroyed. Instead of repenting and begging God again to save his people, he does nothing. It seems that, for he thought, why not, if there will be peace and security in my day? As a kingly contrast, God later chose to reveal himself to King Josiah and the nation he led. King Josiah was a man with a repentant heart, willing, when he saw the wrong, to turn towards the right. He shows he's willing to follow the Lord. Jehoiakim was another evil king. The Bible makes it clear that Jehoiakim was one of the most evil of all the kings, as was his father Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim had been caught and imprisoned by the Babylonians, as God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to capture Judah due to the sins of Jehoiakim and the Judeans. All the holy vessels were taken, anything valuable stolen, and then Jerusalem burned. Then, 37 years later, the new king of Babylon, Evil Merodach, released Jehoiakim from prison, for reasons that are unclear in the Bible. Evil Merodach even asked Jehoiakim to eat with him regularly, and provided him with an allowance. Part of the purpose of the Book of Kings is to provide a cultural history of Israel, that the Israelites can read and understand the history of their people. The authors and compilers of the books use devices such as simultaneous telling of the histories of Israel and Judah. Accounts of Israelite kings always accompany accounts of contemporary kings in Judah. The narrator then describes how God views each king. Each reign is labelled as good or evil, and provides a moral evaluation of Israel and Judah's history. Judah appears generally more good than Israel, since it has more good kings, a trend that reflects God's promise to Solomon that he will bless Judah, because it is the site of King David's legacy in Jerusalem. On the whole, however, both Judah and Israel have a majority of evil kings. In spite of Hezekiah and Josiah's laudable reforms in Judah, the attacks by Assyria and Babylon appear to be punishment for the religious deterioration of the Israelites. As the book's religious protagonists, Elijah and Elisha, illustrate that the nature of prophets has changed throughout the Old Testament. Elijah and Elisha are located on the outskirts of communities, and they utter mystical warnings or oracles to Israel that are fatalistic at best. Rather than leading the people to greatness, Elijah's contest with the priests of Baal is merely an attempt to diminish the people's ongoing evil. Elisha's healing of the peasant boy only helps to ease pain. The narrator mentions Elisha's death only in passing, and Elijah is not actually buried in Israel. He is instead taken straight into heaven by supernatural means, an event that suggests that the land is too evil for God's prophets. Whereas God formally presents himself to Moses using thunder and lightning, God's small, gentle whisper to Elijah shows that the people's worship of other deities has effectively quelled God's voice in Israel. If you would like to know more, then do contact us at any of the contact addresses that are given on this slide. Or if you're ever in the Radstock area one Sunday morning, then why not come along to our 10:30 service at the Baptist Church? You will always be very welcome.